Dear friends, welcome to the Priest Podcast, sponsored by the Napa Institute. You may not know it, but one of Napa's most meaningful efforts involves the formation and support of priests and religious. We have become fascinated by the stories of our clergy. Through this podcast, we want to bring you some of these amazing stories too, but in a way that is unique. Priests interviewing other priests from all walks of life and backgrounds. We think this series will be a great resource for everyone, those considering the priesthood, as well as those in active ministry who may be struggling or just looking for good ideas. But even the laity will benefit by learning more about the needs and thoughts of the clergy as we consider how to support and pray for them, given all they do for us. So sit back and enjoy this glimpse into the life and work of the priest.
Hello, everyone. I am Msgr Roger Landry, today's host for the Shepherd Circle Priest Podcast, produced by the Napa Institute. I'm delighted to welcome to the podcast Father Thomas Joseph White, a Dominican priest who is now Rector Magnificus of the Pontifical University of St. Thomas Aquinas in Rome, aka the Angelicum. He's a native of southeastern Georgia, studied at Brown University, where he converted to Catholicism, did his doctoral studies in theology at Oxford University, and is the author of various books and many articles. In 2011, he was appointed an ordinary member of the Pontifical Academy of St. Thomas Aquinas, a really big deal even for an 80-year-old. He was just in his he was still in his 30s and just about 40. In 2023, he was elected president of the Academy of Catholic Theology, another big deal, and was awarded the title of Master of Sacred Theology, one of the highest academic awards in the Dominican Order. He taught at the Dominican House of Studies in Washington, D.C. from 2008 to 2018, and was the founder and director of the Thomistic Institute in Washington from 2009 until his departure for Rome in 2018, when he was assigned to teach at the Angelicum and function as the director of the Angelicum's Thomistic Institute. On the side, he is a founding member, a songwriter, and a banjo player of the well-known bluegrass band, the Hillbilly Thomists. Father Thomas Joseph White, thanks for joining us on the Priest Podcast.
Thank you, Monsignor. It's great to be here.
We normally start our program by looking at the way God calls individual men to become altri Christi, the other Christ at the altar. Can you share a little bit about your story from growing up in Georgia as a non-Catholic to converting at Brown to the first sort of senses that God might be calling you to be a Dominican and a priest?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about that. You can interrupt me or redirect questions if this is, becomes laborious or boring. I mean, I have a healthy distrust of talking about autobiography, but I can say a few things. Okay, so I suppose I should preface this by saying I grew up in Southeast Georgia in the 1970s and early 80s in a context in which there was still something of the Bible Belt present. And, my mother's Presbyterian. I went to church with her every couple of weeks. I was not baptized. I had I would say a minimal biblical literacy. I did know something about the Old and New Testaments, but not a doctrinal formation or of any real kind in, say, Reformed Christianity. I wasn't like a confessional Reformed teenager, right? And I was a somewhat agnostic or moderate, like weakly theistic, non-baptized person accompanying Protestant Christianity. My parents wanted me to consider the academic opportunity of going to one of the elite boarding schools, and I, by my own free volition, accepted to go to Phillips Academy Andover in Massachusetts when I was 16. And so that was really the beginning of my religious questioning, because it was a very demanding academic environment. And in fact, when I went to Brown University 2 years later, I have to say it was even in a certain way easier academically than those 2 years at Andover. But I was surrounded by, I'd say, emotionally immature, but extremely intellectually precocious kids from the age of 16 to 18. And there was a lot of religious skepticism. You might say I kind of encountered Northeastern acidic liberal atheism, or globally kind of existentialist secular culture, and became immersed in reading modern authors. That was part of what we were taught to do, literature, and even a little bit of intellectual history. And I acquired religious questions at that time, and I started to dip my toe into reading just the most basic books. And I'll just tell you one thing I remember was that the liberal Congregationalist pastor there at the time, who was a very thoughtful man, had been a Yale man, gave me a book by Martin Buber, I and Thou. And part of the reason he did that was because Buber, who was a famous rabbinic theologian, posits that the deepest mystery in reality is personal. That is to say, behind the veil of all things material, there is a transcendent personal mystery we call God, and that we can encounter him as a thou, or in a personal encounter. So it wasn't for me like, have you had a personal encounter with Jesus? It was more inquisitive. Is there a personal reality behind the veil of all things, But that was a question. And when I moved to Brown, when I was 18, I really wanted to figure out sort of what I thought was the ultimate explanatory principle. And is it materialism? I mean, we read some Dawkins in biology. I found that too simplistic or maybe unconvincing, but I didn't really know why. And I took classes on Buddhism and classical Vedantic Hinduism and yoga of the theoretical kind. And I wasn't practicing that stuff, but I was interested in the idea that maybe there's a kind of religious principle behind everything that's not necessarily personal, but numinous and meaningful. Anyway, in the middle of all that, I had read some Flannery O'Connor, and I had read some Thomas Merton, and I had learned about the Jesus prayer. And I got this idea that maybe if there is a personal reality, I could meet it, I could encounter it. And I started praying the Jesus prayer, Lord Jesus Christ, Son of the living God, have mercy on me, a sinner. And kind of doing it meditatively, more like an experiment. And then when I was, in my second part of my first year in college, I came across the author Karl Barth, famous Protestant theologian. He wrote a book from his visit to to Princeton Theological Seminary, and I think in 1963 or something like that, called Introduction to Evangelical Theology. And it's a very fine Protestant work of theology. And I read it like basically in a day in the science library, actually at Brown, under fluorescent lights in a brutalist architectural room. And in that experience of reading, I began to sense the presence of Christ in a very real way. And that was like all these things came together. There is a principle behind reality. It is personal. In Christ we encounter it. Of course, that's all said much later after the fact, but that was what I experienced intuitively. And I remember going home and like feeling that I had touched the meaning of the universe, with my mind. And it was very personal and also very objective and very interior. Like I'd had this interior experience of Christ that was life altering. And so I went the next day to the Protestant chaplain and asked to be baptized, as one does, because if Christ is real, I need to be baptized. I mean, it was an intuition of faith I was following. And I eventually was baptized. And then I thought, then things started to concretize a little, but I was still disoriented. And that's when I began to study ancient Christianity. There was
Let me interrupt you just for a second. Were you actually baptized the following day after your request?
No, sorry. I asked to be baptized, and I was baptized a few months later.
Okay, please continue.
Yeah, and then I basically got into studying ancient Christianity because I was trying to figure out how to be Christian, and I went back to sources. And there, what transpired is very stereotypical. As John Henry Newman says, to be deep in history is to cease to be Protestant. And as I read Augustine and Athanasius and John Chrysostom and Origen, and then started reading de Lubac and Balthazar and Rahner and Ratzinger and John Paul II over the course of years, I certainly didn't understand everything, but I got fascinated with, you could say, the intellectual Catholic vitality of the tradition. And eventually then to resolve that question, you'd think, well, he read his way into the church. I did, but it was really in a way experiential because I went to a Benedictine monastery in Petersham, Massachusetts, St. Mary's Monastery, when I was a senior. This is 3 years later. And I did a retreat there. And that's when I really experienced Eucharistic adoration for the first time. And as soon as the monstrance was put out on the altar, which I'd never really seen, and the monks and the sisters there, they have both nuns and monks in two different monasteries, they were singing in choir. And I really experienced the presence of Christ in the room. And, in a way, once Christ is present in the Eucharist, like everything else is sort of secondary. I mean, how can the Catholic Church be wrong about anything else if if she's right about the Eucharistic presence of Christ in the monstrance. I was so concrete. Now, I don't say all my intellectual questions just went away, not at all, but I realized like I had to become Catholic.
Let me ask. So in your list of all the books that you read, there was one figure that I was waiting to hear you mention that you just didn't, and I don't know if he was an oversight or you just didn't read him at the time, and he was born in Aquino, Italy.
Yeah, no, I never really. I knew a little of Aquinas. The closest I got was reading Etienne Gilson's Introduction to the Philosophy of Thomas Aquinas, which I read the 5th edition, and it's a rather important. Well, it's this 5th edition of Le Thomisme in French. I'm remembering the French title, but it's a rather substantial book. And I took a summer to read that, and I only understood some of it. Honestly, I could never understand Aquinas before I entered seminary. I thought it was just too much technical vocabulary, and I was interested in it. That's one of the reasons I really wanted to study philosophy in the Catholic Church, so I could get my mind around what's going on. But no, I was in the more, Neoplatonic, patristic, and modern existentialist strands of Catholic literature. But, I discovered the pontificate of John Paul II alongside Joseph Ratzinger. I was very influenced by that, and kind of had to surrender to the Catholic Church's whole approach to things, the sacramental. And then, I became Catholic my senior year. Now, I could transition here to the question of the priestly vocation because it came up pretty quickly, but I don't know if that's helpful.
It would be helpful, but like it's normal, as you know, having brought people into the church, that when people make that type of a transition with the cost that's involved, a lot of the times it's not that much more of a price to pay to give everything for the Lord, because one's already giving up a lot, including sometimes friendships, sometimes family relationships, and everything else like this. But just talk about you asked the chaplain there at Brown to receive you into the church, and did he put you through an OCIA class? Did he have you do some type of independent study?
Campus. Yeah, I decided to go off campus. I mean, now, there've been a series of chaplains and there were good men there, but I felt like I guess my instinct was I wanted to get out of any risk of getting an artificially compromised Catholic catechesis because of the secular and skeptical and liberal circumstances. I wanted to get off campus and get, ordinary catechism. Now, in fact, I had an excellent catechist who was an Opus Dei priest. And I went through at the time, what we called RCIA, of course. And that was an important time of discernment for me. And like the beginning of seeing the logic, the deeper relationship of things, but it was just new. I still, I really, in a way, I came in through the desire to practice sacramentally, and I was reading spiritual authors as well, like Teresa of Avila, who obviously suggests that there are multiple dimensions of the spiritual life, and this could go somewhere. One thing that was very attractive to me about Catholicism is this idea that there are stages in life's journey, and it's not just static, that you're justified by grace alone, and that's kind of the most important thing. But that instead there's a kind of a invitation to be, yes, justified by grace, but then to live in a collaboration with God where God's gracing you, sanctifying you, and your life takes on a sort of multidimensional story. Yeah, you're a sinner, but there's an adventure of discovering God more deeply over time. I was really attracted to that as a young Catholic.
And so at the time that you were becoming a Catholic, you experienced a draw toward the priesthood before you experienced a draw toward the Dominican life, or were they simultaneous?
Well, okay, so when I became Catholic, it's true that at Brown University, that was thought of as a very strange thing, and yeah, there were people who were hostile, and there were people who were alienated by it. My parents took it fairly well because they could see it had deep effects on my happiness and my sense of well-being, and they later, adjusted to be becoming a priest with some difficulty, but they're great friends of mine and have been, in some ways, really just tremendous supporters, despite not being Catholic. But what the priests, the Benedictine monks who helped me become Catholic, told me was, the priesthood, if you feel called to it, is a later decision and you have some time. You need to spend some years as a layperson and really live successfully as a lay Catholic who's active and participatory in the world and, thriving or seeking to do your best as a lay Catholic to understand that state in life. And you can consider, dating or marrying, date as a chaste Catholic man and try to discern marriage if you do that, but or don't because you're waiting to consider the priesthood, but live as a balanced, sacramentally practicing Catholic and deep in your prayer life, which was great advice. And I got into Oxford as a graduate student right about that time to do 2-year patristics course. So I went there, and there I had a great Catholic friends. I mean, that was a really blessed time for me. I also had great Protestant and non-Christian friends, but I was in a really wonderful place with wonderfully intellectual young Catholics, and I was taught by Dominicans and Benedictine, Franciscans, Jesuits. And so I really learned a lot about the Catholic intellectual life in those 2 years. And that's when I encountered the Dominicans. And, in that time, over those 2 years, my sense that from the beginning I was called to religious life, I really felt from the beginning I was called to religious life while I was visiting this Benedictine monastery, that began to crystallize and become more acute. Another part of me, definitely, I was a 22 to 24-year-old man. I mean, part of me, I wanted to get married. I mean, I knew all these fantastic young Christian women, and one of them I thought was a fantastic person. I was able easily to imagine dating or getting married, but and not without chagrin, but I mean, with resoluteness that was still sacrificial. I decided not to pursue any of that because I really need to get this vocation thing figured out. So I'm not saying it was perfectly, spiritually harmonious, but I basically decided to go ahead and allow the Lord to test that vocation in me, or to test that vocation in me before the Lord. And, I continued to pray. I took on the regime of, I went to mass the majority of the days of the week. I went to confession every week as a new Catholic. I went to start saying the rosary frequently. And I tried to take on mental prayer, as a daily or at least every other day kind of practice as a 22-year-old, 23-year-old. And, so I pushed myself for a 22-year-old who's coming out of a secular background. That's pushing yourself. And I studied a lot of theology, and I became great friends with a Dominican deacon at the time, later priest, who was very bright and discovered a little bit the Dominican charism of, the intellectual life. I think what I, realized over time was, yeah, it's a sacrifice not to get married, of course, but the living for the gospel can be this really deep, spiritually elevated thing I could perhaps stabilize in, with the help of the search for the truth, friendships, liturgical life and prayer and the Mass, and an apostolate, like the idea of helping other people. I did help some people at Oxford become Catholic as a layperson, and that also was a kind of discovery. Like evangelization was a discovery for me as a lay Catholic, how that could affect other people's lives, just to share the faith with them. And I think when I saw the Dominican order, I saw those constituent elements of a fraternal life that's centered on the search for the truth and study in a liturgical and Eucharistic context with apostolate. But, that was a sort of stage in my vocation.
And so eventually you petitioned to become a Dominican.
Yeah, well, there is a hiccup here. The Dominicans in the 90s, mid 90s, there were a lot of the still crises going on in the order. And I was sort of warned about that. I mean, I had a spiritual director who was a Jesuit. He was not anti-Dominican, but he is warning me about difficulties in the Jesuits. And, there were. And so this is a real question, how to become, because I didn't feel called to a purely monastic Benedictine life. And when I looked at these two great orders, the Dominicans and the Jesuits, I was warned a little bit by the members themselves that things are rocky right now and they might get worse and not better, and you need to be careful. Well, I listened to that. And so I eventually went off and looked at one of the new communities in France, which is the famous community of St. John, founded by a Dominican, founded by a Dominican philosopher. And, I went to visit them. It was very austere in France, in Burgundy. It was very young, very poor in a radical way, very connected to prayer and monastic liturgy. And so I entered. And in 1995, I became a member of the Brothers of St. John, and I lived there for 7 years. And I'll say just something brief about this. I was not ordained while I was there, but I did make final vows, and then I had to transfer those to the Dominicans. As everyone probably knows who knows anything about that community, they did experience the travails of later finding out that the founder had terrible moral problems, and in some ways was I guess you could say a moral imposter, if I could put it that strongly. Of course, I knew him well. I mean, he taught philosophy, and I studied under him, but I did not know about about the abuse patterns in the community. What I did see, though, in the 7 years I was there, eventually more clearly over time, was a pattern of spiritual control and just a kind of cult of personality. It was pretty acute. Now, I say that with great respect for my friends in the community of St. John who I know and who I respect. They study at the Angelicum now, and the community's been very open about trying to be transparent about and learn about these patterns of abuse and correct things in the community. The current superior is a wonderful man who I was in formation with, and a very brave man. And I have good things to say about the men in that community. But, it was a trauma for everybody involved. And for me, the clear discernment was that there's something off here that is not at the service of the church. But I have also discovered things that are of the church. I mean, there was a lot of Eucharistic adoration. I learned to read and understand Aquinas and the Thomistic tradition in depth in the modern French tradition. I did my doctorate going back to Oxford while I was with that community. But there were also just huge traumas and difficulties and people who were damaged very deeply. So I saw a kind of underside of the church too. And I had to keep my faith through that, which I did. And I was helped by a lot of great theologians in that very confusing experience of a new religious community of renewal that in fact has this underside of disorder. And coming through that, I really actually became more discerning about what the church is and more committed to what the church is, and also more sober and realistic about like the fallen character of the human person and the need to, to have a lot of criteria when you talk about what successful Christian life is. I don't think I didn't really participate that much in the problems of the community. I was in a way protected from being deeply damaged by it, but I did know people who were deeply damaged by it. And when I became a Dominican in 2003, I went to Washington, D.C. 2002, I got permission to go transfer to the Dominican order. I went to Washington, D.C. and joined the province of St. Joseph. Over the course of time, I had to do a transitus canonically, which takes time. So I had a long time in formation. I was in formation for basically 11, 12 years before I was ordained a priest. So that was a lot of patience. But when I became a Dominican, I felt immediately very at home. And the order was undergoing a revival, a renewal. That province, there's a magnificent renewal that happened starting before I even entered. And I was grateful to participate in it. And things were a lot more just generally sound and reasonable, but also sort of a sane spirituality. And so I've really found my place as a Dominican over time. But that initial instinct to want something that's monastic but active and studious but communitarian has always really guided me.
And so you are formed as a Dominican. Eventually, you are ordained a priest. What were your early years as a priest like? And eventually, your province decides that you're going to be a teacher, and then your entrepreneurial spirit starts to come out with the Thomistic Institute and other things. But what were the first steps as a Dominican and eventually as a Dominican priest like?
Well, I was really blessed as a priest. I remember as a Dominican first, making solemn vows as a Dominican, I felt this enormous peace. It was like coming into, as Newman says, the ship coming through the storm, coming into safe harbor and finding repose. He talks about then the apologia pro sua vita when he came into the Catholic Church. I felt that way in the Catholic Church, but I especially felt that way when I made solemn vows as a Dominican. I had come into safe harbor, and that's just how it was for me. I had this spiritual peace. And I had a great fraternal collegiality with the people I was with. but I wasn't still doing very much apostolate. I'm like 37, and then become a deacon very quickly. I still had a quiet diaconate. But the day I was ordained a priest, I remember getting up off the floor, and after you've said the prayers, prostrate, and then you have the laying of hands and celebrate the mass. It's all kind of blindsided by it all, but then afterwards, all the people coming up to get a blessing, and suddenly I'm completely different in the way people are treating me. Like, I'm a source of blessing to them. This power is in me to bless them that has been given to me. It hasn't changed my character. I mean, in the sense of my human character, it has imposed what we call the character. That's a different thing, of course. But I've been changed by it ontologically, but my virtues are the same, for better or worse. But now I'm like a source of grace. And that was just such a realization of the gratuity, the gift of the priesthood. And I have to say, I hit the ground running, just like overwhelmed with gratitude that I could employ this sacral power, not in any way to harm other people and not to manipulate people, but only to serve and bless and grace other people in a compassionate and truth-centered way. And it just was like a consolidation of my life, of what I'd studied, of what I'd aspired to, of my religious life, of my inner calling. And suddenly I could do this. I could bless people, but I could especially consecrate, confect the Eucharist, celebrate the sacrifice of the Mass, and preach in that context, ordering people by preaching towards the acceptance of the Catholic faith in view of a life of sanctification and happiness with Christ in the Eucharist. And I could absolve sins. And, so I started hearing confessions at the National Shrine across the street from the Dominican House of Studies, hearing hours of confessions. And, at this point, I'm, 37 years old. So I have a little life experience, which is helpful. And I've got a lot of theological reading, and I've already been teaching for some time in various instances. So, I mean, communication is not difficult. So, starting to do sacred preaching, starting to celebrate Mass reverently, singing the Mass beautifully, trying to, and then helping people through the mercy of the sacrament of confession. It was so meaningful. And I mean, it was life-changing, and like for me, just deeply, deeply consoling, and it's like stabilizing. I felt like both when I got ordained a deacon and a priest, I received this deep grace of stability. I mean, a lot of I'm capable of anxiety and of fretting like everybody else, and I have more perhaps than most people. But I tell you, when I got ordained a priest, like something stable was put in me, and I really felt that existentially. But it was deeper than what I could just feel. It was like something took over my life in a great way to make me a kind of source of stability and peace to other people through truth, through fortitude, through compassion that is perseverant. And I've made mistakes. I'm a sinful person, but I mean, I've also been really strengthened to help other people. Now, the order asked me almost right away to teach theology, but I should say here, I was teaching theology in Washington, D.C. to young Dominicans. And that, I mean, I've always been good at that in the sense that I'm not saying great, but just like I can do it correctly, laying out the principles of Catholic thought historically, systematically, trying to look at controversies, being orthodox, but also being intellectually open-minded. And I'm not saying I do it very, very well. I'm only saying I do it adequately. But like that was a great thing to ally with the priesthood. But I say all that because like I wasn't only a seminary professor, although I think that's an amazing thing to do, and I've always loved doing it. But being in downtown DC, I also have always from the beginning done a lot of pastoral apostolate, especially with young people. So I taught adult instruction in the Catholic faith at some of the parishes in downtown DC. I did a fair amount of spiritual direction. I help people who are entering the Catholic Church consider the difficulties and questions, sometimes the complex family problems about accepting the faith. I worked with a lot of people thinking about a religious vocation. I actually also ended up, for various reasons, working a lot with abuse victims, not of Catholic priests, but just in general. And that's been an enormous blessing to me, an enormous privilege I've had to work with a lot of people who are trying to process the grief and distress of abuse in light of the mystery of Christ's reality, trying to struggle with that. So I had a lot of practical experience as a professor, because sometimes you think, well, a professor is just kind of a cognitive guy. maybe he's a pious cognitive guy, but he's not doing pastoral apostolate. But I had a great both and experience of teaching and doing pastoral apostolate for 10 years in DC. That was before the Thomistic Institute. That was happening while the Thomistic Institute was unfolding.
The Dominicans are called the Order of Preachers. And so preaching, sacred preaching, as Thomas talks about it, is a unit of element in Dominican life. Did you have a clear sense as you were teaching, as you were ministering to victims of abuse of one sort or another, as you were preparing people to enter into the church, as you were hearing confessions at the National Shrine and other places, that this was all part of the mission that you had been given to preach, which the Church in the Second Vatican Council said is the first duty of a priest?
I mean, I don't have a great answer to that because I don't know exactly why I'm going to say this, but I would say, to me, there is a slight distinction between preaching, teaching, and giving counsel. And I would say teaching is in a way the easiest. I mean, it's hard in that you have to study for a long time, right? I mean, but if you study theology long enough and you have a habit of doing it, teaching is very safe, right? You can stop and tell a humorous anecdote. You can build up an argument that's based on not your own ingenuity or insight, but based on classical principles. You can give people kind of sound and safe, secure, but also kind of profound and challenging truths that come from the tradition. Preaching, I feel like you're more exposed. I mean, because preaching, you of course teach, and my way of preaching is doctrinal. I do preach about the mysteries. In a way, it's a safer way to preach. I do, morally exhort a little bit or talk about moral examples or examples of the lives of the saints. But I mean, I often just preach about the mysteries of the faith, which is kind of out of the outcropping of teaching. But I mean, I think when you preach, you are in front of Christ, and you're exposing yourself. I don't think it's great to preach about yourself. I don't do it. I don't like it myself at all. But I think inevitably you are in front of a community in the presence of Christ in the Eucharist, talking about the ultimate sacred things in a way that suggests that you are responsible for a life of integrity before Jesus Christ in the face of the sacrifice of the Mass and the presence of the Eucharist. And I think in front of that, we're all basically somehow deficient. And yet that deficiency is also the opportunity to believe more deeply in the mercy of God and to preach the mercy of God, right? To be the first saved. I say, the Marines, they say, the first in, the last to leave, never leave no man behind. But, I think the priest or the religious is the first saved, the first redeemed. I'm here before them talking about Christ crucified because I'm the first one to need and to depend upon the redemption and the mercy and grace of the cross. That is what makes me able to preach. Now, of course, I should live a life of integrity, but it's because I've received the grace of Christ and I'm trying to live in the mercy and grace of Christ that I can aspire to an integral life of integrity. So that I think is a kind of preaching. I feel more vulnerable, Counsel in the confessional is a kind of different thing because you can teach some general principles. I don't really preach to people. I sort of give advice as almost like I'm on their side as a sinner with the sinners, or as a vulnerable person with the other. I always say, I always say to people, if they're worried about it, when you confess your sins, it's the most beautiful thing in the world because you see the soul in its desire for the truth about itself before God. And that's something, people who are confessing feel vulnerable. Yeah, they're vulnerable. But what I see is the grace of desiring to be true before God. And there's nothing stronger in the universe than a soul desiring to be in the truth before God in light of its own sinful fragility, but also its aspiration to love God above all things. And that's awesome to behold. It's a huge privilege for the priest to hear that and witness to it, and then give the actual effective communication of grace, forgiveness, and mercy to that person in that awesome state in which they're seeking to be true before God. And so I think the counsel you give there maybe is secondary to the absolution, but you can say something true and beautiful to the person that's practical, that's fraternal, sacerdotal. Anyway, so yeah, I mean, but you're right. The Dominican charism is trying to think about how to speak across this whole spectrum and register of areas of discourse.
One of the ways you have particularly preached is as a theologian. Theologian comes from logos theou, somebody who says a word about God. And you have done that not just in the classroom, but you've done it through lots of books and articles and even lectures. Talk about the subjectivity of the theologian and how you do you, when you're teaching through your writing, are you doing a similar thing as you do in a classroom, but just for a different audience? Or subjectively, does that seem like a totally different exercise as you're putting together an article or various chapters in one of your theological works?
I think that different people would answer that question differently, because there are theologians who write more of, say, for example, in polemical circumstances. And I think I wrote that way more when I was in my 30s. Well, let's say they're bothered by what they consider to be a serious error and they want to respond to it. And I think there's great nobility and worth in that. There's people who are more interested in beauty and poetics, and that's also very worthwhile. I'm a little more didactic, because I guess what I think about theology is it is like teaching. It's a different vehicle. It's an attempt to give a synoptic and cosmopolitan overview of the perspective of the faith, taking account of the wider cultural milieu, taking account also the wider culture of Catholic intellectual tradition. So in other words, you're reaching back into the tradition, especially for me, Aquinas, Newman, and you're thinking about what this means for today in light of other prevailing religious or non-religious viewpoints. And you're trying to articulate what the faith is and means for the human race at a higher level. And in a way, it's just coming out as a personal exercise of trying to make sense of the world in the light of Christ and the truth of the Christian faith. I put an emphasis on, you might say, the third transcendental, that being truth after beauty and unity. I'm really interested in trying to make clear how to think and argue about fundamental principles, partly because I think we live in a time of deep intellectual disorientation and distraction. And there's a forgetfulness of so much of the Catholic tradition, but I don't think we should be antiquarian and, you might say, nostalgic, but rather we should bring forth the principles of tradition like Aquinas or Augustine into the contemporary world and show not only their perennial value, but their contemporary usefulness. But to do that, we need to make clear what those principles are and why they're useful, how they're illuminating today. So I'm not as interested in being as numinous a writer. I don't try to point towards what's sublime and maybe almost unspeakable, which I think is valuable, but I just don't do that kind of writing as much. I try to give people fundamental orientation to how to think about the mysteries of the faith in ways that I think respect the mystery. I'm not trying to capture it and put it in a crystalline logic or a all too human, reasonable systemization. I'm just trying to point to it and make progress in contemplating and understanding it, and making that intelligibility transmissible is very important to me. I want young priests and religious, young Catholic academics to be able to understand the mysteries sufficiently to transmit them intergenerationally, because I think we've had a rupture with the past where we haven't sufficiently transmitted classical thought about the mystery of God. So that's my apostolate in terms of writing. I'm trying to, you might say, pass a baton, like in a race, where if you drop the baton, the relay doesn't continue down through time. And we need people to take the baton and run vigorously and, you might say, wisely to the next relay point and pass on the baton of Catholic tradition. That does mean thinking new thoughts and engaging with new questions. It does mean testing principles against new forms of contestation or new opportunities for advanced learning. But it also means showing the perenniality and, you might say, as Newman says, the chronic vigor of classical principles like those of Thomas Aquinas. And I think that's really important for stabilization. The church has a lot of instability. The world around us is unstable. People don't know what a human person is. They don't know what a human soul is. They don't understand what justice and freedom are or what the intellect is. So I think having a lot of a grounding in anthropological realism, in a realism about what we say metaphysics, the essences and natures of things, the causation of things, the mystery of being, the mystery of beauty, of truth, of goodness, trying to articulate that culture of learning that gives people formation in perennial principles and then fortitude to patiently and liberally, I would say, engage with new ideas, but still be centered on something classical. That's what I'm trying to do in writing theology.
Thank you. Another apostolate and another baton passing is serving as the magnificent rector of the Pontifical University of St. Thomas Aquinas, which was where St. John Paul II went, which is where Pope Leo XIV has gone. Talk to us about those responsibilities. Were there aspects of this sort of administration and fundraising and all the types of things beyond teaching that came with that's been a difficult transition for you, or has it been a rather smooth transition to being the public face of a community of Dominicans that are trying to help the future generation, not just of priests and religious, but also lay faithful, take up their position in the mission of the church?
Well, I mean, being the rector of the Angelicum is a really unmerited honor, even if the Angelicum has its own fragilities as an institution historically and requires constant care and attention. Being the rector of the Pontifical University, where, as you said, these important folks have studied and also we've had great theologians teach, is a great privilege. It's true, it comes with a lot of administrative obligations I have never undertaken at this level. I did direct the Thomistic Institute in Washington, D.C. for 10 years. I worked very hard at that. But this is a different level up. And I have to say, I think every priest knows that the administrative work we do is, laborious. We have to do it to some extent, but we have to do it wisely. Like, you have to make sure there's enough time to pray and study. I do still teach partly so I can stay grounded in a more, I'd say, effectively supernatural apostolate, although administrating an ecclesiastical institution is still serving something important that's ultimately, essentially supernatural, which is the mystery of the communication of the faith in the church. I've been very blessed by having a lot of great staff, including a lot of young lay people I've hired who have happily agreed to work with me, who I delegate a lot to. They would laugh if they heard me, because I'm a maximalist in terms of delegation. I mean, I do check in on a daily basis with people, but I try to hire people I can give a lot of responsibility to. And I don't do that so I'm not having responsibilities, but just so that there's a shared community of experts. I have also religious sisters who work with me who are magnificent, who do an enormous amount of work. And then also fellow Dominicans, professors, also Dominicans working with me in fundraising. So, I mean, I'm like part of a team. I would not work if I weren't part of a large team, and we're expanding the team on a continual basis. So that's also a stress, because you have to look at all the coordination of efforts, the professional shared responsibilities, and of course, human personalities, different points of view, small emotional, dramas. And through all that, though, there's the possibility of bonding more closely with other people in a shared apostolate that's very important. I guess the way I think about it is administration for me has been, it's been more difficult, of course, but it's been an enormous opportunity I would never have had if I hadn't undertaken it. And we've been able to do a lot in terms of renewing the mission of the Angelicum, fundraising, hiring new professors, renovations, scholarships, but really, I'd say at the heart of it, creating a school, renewing our school of theology and our philosophy to try to have one of the best formation centers, I think, of Catholic philosophy and theology that's available. I mean, not in an exclusive way, but it's a pole in a world, in a multipolar academic world of Catholic thought. It's one of the locations. And that's been very meaningful to me, because I really believe in changing the culture through the effective expression and communication of ideas that change people's lives, and empowering young priests, seminarians, priests, religious sisters, and lay people studying in Rome to have that formation to go out and communicate to other people. I prefer to be on the front lines. I prefer to be in the trenches. I'd rather talk to secular people in downtown Washington, D.C. or in New York or in one of the, universities where the Thomistic Institute's been present for, a decade or two. I'd rather do that than administrate an institution that's helping other people do that. But it is meaningful to administrate an institution that's helping people achieve a formation that will make them effective missionaries in the 21st century. And, it's what God's asking me to do right now as I see it through divine providence, through obedience to my superiors. It's not something I need or want to do forever, but I want to do it, right and well. And there is a kind of paternity to it, or a priestly spiritual life to it, because you want to bring the light of Christ, the life of Christ as a priest into that domain. And even though a lot of it's, you might say, more professional, natural, rational decision-making about how to run an institution, that's also always under the aegis of Christ, despite our human fragilities. And Mass and Eucharistic adoration are at the center of the Angelicum, teaching the mystery of Christ, teaching faithfully the mystery of the church's life and her practices. So overseeing that and wanting that to be strengthened and enriched is a part of the priestly charism, or the munera of the priesthood for me.
Two final questions for me. You were involved in the founding of the Thomistic Institute. What problem did you see, and how is the Thomistic Institute oriented toward addressing that problem you saw when you founded it?
Well, the problem is, though, although we have excellent campus ministers in many secular universities, and I think the bishops have put a lot of work into this in ways that wasn't the case maybe 40, 50 years ago, when a lot of Catholics studied in the Catholic schools. Now we are sending great young priests and experienced mature priests into the non-Catholic chaplaincies. Nevertheless, there's also the problem of bringing Catholic intellectual life inside the classrooms of secular campuses. And so we created a delivery system to do that, which is basically through student groups, which have the right to form and then bring in expert speakers, whether lay or clerical, onto campus to give profound academic perspectives on philosophy, theology, history, literature, art. And that's now under Father Dominic Legg's leadership, now under Father Ambrose Little. That after 17 years, the Thomistic Institute's on, I think, about 120 to 130 campuses and ever expanding. And so it nurtures intellectual life at the heart of the secular university, Catholic intellectual life at the heart of the secular university, and not just for Catholics. It's an invitation to non-Catholics to become Christians.
And highly consequential in those campuses and in the lives that have been changed through TI. Last question that I want to bring up is you're one of the founding members and the banjoist of the Hillbilly Thomists. Was that just something that Dominicans got together and said, let's have some fun? Or was there an apostolic purpose from the beginning where you would be able to get out in front of different audiences you might not contact in ordinary means? We know the importance of music in our culture to be able to transmit truth. What was the founding impulse of the Hillbilly Thomists, and how much do you personally derive from playing the banjo and singing?
Well, that was definitely for fun, and it was just unplanned, but we basically played music together in the Dominican House of Studies in Washington, D.C. as an amusement, but we eventually made a CD just to kind of see if we could, make some money for the formation. And it was just to sell it at like parishes over Christmas. But actually, this is in the last age of the CD. It went viral, or so to speak. I mean, it was purchased widely, and it went on the Billboard charts in bluegrass music, to our great surprise. But it's a niche thing: Dominican friars playing bluegrass music. At the same time, I'd say the band was good. I mean, not because of me, but I'm okay. But I'm a moderate level banjo player. But there were a number of young professional-minded people in the band. I mean, professional level musicians. And so then we decided, in light of the first success, to record some more albums. Actually, just next week, as we're recording this, we're about to make our 5th album, And we've had 3 on the Billboard charts in bluegrass music. It's moderately successful. Look, I think the most important thing, though, is what we discovered is the music means something else or something complementary to the people who listen to it. And we've been very surprised. I think of a man who spoke to me at one of our concerts, an older retired Marine, I think it was, military person. He said, I want to thank you guys for your albums. It really helped me get through the year my daughter was dying of cancer, and it really helped me get through the year after she died of cancer. And, I was just like, I was speechless. I mean, you write these songs kind of as a ways of thinking playfully, poetically about the mystery of God's mercy, or somewhat humorously about like Christian life. And then they mean something very different or very deep to some people. And we have a lot of children also a lot of children love the music and learn all the words by heart. So I didn't plan to have a big children's ministry through the band, but that has just happened. And I'm not really sure what to make of it. I mean, I guess the truth is I don't feel a lot of pressure to succeed as a banjo player, but I do love doing it. And when we do have the occasional time to play a concert here and there, you see that it's something important in people's lives. And I guess that's made it like more important to me than it was when it was more playful. Although I still feel just a delight or a sense of, I don't know, creative freedom when I'm playing and when we're writing songs.
How much practice do you need to put into keeping the skill?
I do it as my therapy, honestly. I keep a banjo and a beautiful guitar in my office in Rome, and I play pretty much every day, like here and there when I have time. I might play for half an hour. I was playing earlier today. And it just is I don't know, it's like a source of rest for me. And so then songs come about partly as a kind of almost like what some people would like to do puzzles. Or they might, it's like people like to do puzzles or like maybe play board games. I don't know. For me, like writing songs is a kind of a poetic amusement. It's a little bit more serious than amusement, but it's like an amusement.
And in general, you start with lyrics, or in general, you start with melodies, or do they come simultaneously?
The melodies, and I get like maybe a catch line comes to me, and then I have to work hard on the lyrics, which isn't really something that's obvious from the quality of the lyrics themselves. But to make that all work out takes more work.
And during these days when you're teaching the Religious Sisters of Mercy of Alma in Michigan, any songs coming to mind serving these beautiful women?
Well, I'm not writing right now because we're going into recording next week. I've written several songs. I don't think they'll all be on the album, but what I'm doing right now is I'm trying to relearn them or practice them because I've got to start to perfect them with the other guys next week.
So it's been a wonderful conversation with Father Thomas Joseph White, the Dominican rector of the Pontifical University of St. Thomas in Rome. Imagine what would happen if we had more priests like Father T.J. White. That's why the Lord urges us to each pray to the harvest master for more diligent labors for his harvest. So please join us in praying for shepherds after Jesus' heart and encourage the young men including perhaps non-Catholic young men at places like Phillips Andover or Brown or high schools or college campuses near you to think about Jesus in their prayer and whether Jesus might be calling them to serve him, the church, and the world in one vocation or the next, but particularly as ordained priests. Please check back next week for an interview with another hardworking priest in the Lord's vineyard. I'm Msgr Roger Landry. I've been delighted to be your host today on the Shepherd's Circle podcast. And once more, hearty thanks to Father Thomas Joseph White.
Thanks again for joining us today. For more information about how you can join us in supporting our work with clergy and religious, go to napa-institute.org. May God bless you this day and always.